If we never met, then why does your son look exactly like me? The words didn't come out loud at first. They lingered in Alexander Hayes's mind like a question he wasn't supposed to ask, like a memory that refused to fully form. The late afternoon light stretched across the polished marble floor of Hayes' financial tower, casting long reflections of people who didn't have time to stop, didn't have time to notice the woman standing near the glass doors with a worn leather bag clutched tightly against her chest. Emily Carter adjusted the sleeve of her faded coat, trying to smooth out wrinkles that wouldn't disappear, her fingers trembling just slightly from the cold or maybe from something deeper. She had been standing there for nearly 20 minutes, watching men in tailored suits walk past without a glance, women in heels clicking across the floor like they belonged to a different world entirely. She didn't belong here. She knew it the moment she stepped inside. But she stayed anyway. Because upstairs, somewhere above the 40th floor, was an opportunity she couldn't afford to miss. And somewhere behind her calm expression was a secret she couldn't afford to face. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and the shift in the room was immediate. People straightened, conversations lowered, attention pulled like gravity toward one man stepping out. Alexander Hayes didn't need an introduction. At 42, he carried success like a second skin, tailored navy suit, quiet confidence, eyes that seemed to measure everything without ever raising his voice. He walked forward with purpose, but then he slowed. Not because of the building. Not because of the schedule waiting for him upstairs. Because of her. Emily felt it before she saw it, the weight of someone's gaze settling on her like a spotlight she didn't ask for. She looked up. And for a second, everything else blurred. His eyes didn't just glance at her. They stopped. Focused. Like he was trying to remember something that didn't make sense. Like he was looking at someone he had lost. "We've met before," he said quietly, almost to himself, but the words landed between them like something undeniable. Emily's heart stuttered, just once. Then she shook her head, faster than she meant to, her grip tightening on the bag. "No," she said, her voice steady in a way she didn't feel. "We never met. It should have ended there. A simple mistake. A stranger confusing her with someone else." But Alexander didn't move. Didn't look away. Instead, he took one slow step closer, his expression shifting, not confusion, not certainty, but something in between. Something unsettled. "Then who was there?" he asked, softer now, but sharper somehow, like the question had been waiting for years without him knowing it. Emily felt the air leave her lungs before she could stop it. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across her face, fear, recognition, something too fast to name. Then it was gone. Replaced by the same quiet composure she had learned to wear like armor. "You're mistaken," she said again, but this time, her voice carried something heavier. Not denial. Distance. Like she wasn't just answering him, she was protecting something. Or someone. Behind them, the city kept moving. Phones rang. Doors opened. Lives continued without pause. But between them, time slowed, stretched thin by a question that didn't have an answer yet. And in that silence, neither of them realized that the past wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the moment neither of them could avoid anymore. Emily turned before the silence could trap her, her steps quick but controlled as she moved toward the glass doors, each footstep echoing louder than it should have against the marble floor, as if the building itself refused to let her leave unnoticed, and for a moment she almost made it, almost reached the exit where the cold late afternoon air waited like a shield, but then she heard it, not his voice this time, not words. Just the subtle shift of movement behind her, steady, deliberate, unhurried, and she knew without looking that he had followed, not close enough to alarm, not far enough to dismiss, just present, like a thought that refused to fade, and something in her chest tightened in a way she had not felt in years, not fear exactly, but recognition of a door she had spent so long keeping closed. "Miss," his assistant called from behind, a polished voice cutting through the tension as a woman in a tailored gray suit approached, tablet in hand, her expression professional but curious. "Mr. Hayes has a full schedule. If you are here for an appointment, you will need to check in at reception. The words were polite, but they created distance, a boundary that Emily should have welcomed, yet for some reason it made her feel like she was being pulled in two directions at once, one towards safety, the other towards something unresolved, something dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with harm and everything to do with memory. Emily nodded quickly, lowering her gaze as if that alone could make her invisible. I understand, she said, her voice softer now, almost blending into the background noise of the building. I was just leaving. But she did not move immediately, and neither did he. Alexander stood a few feet away, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression unreadable to anyone else. But inside there was something shifting, something that did not align with logic or routine, because he knew what he saw, not in detail, not in certainty, but in fragments, a silhouette against rain, the faint scent of antiseptic, a voice that had once spoken his name with urgency or maybe relief, he could not tell. And yet it was there, just beyond reach. Wait, he said finally, not loud, not commanding, but enough to stop her, and she did stop, just barely, her shoulders tensing before she slowly turned back to face him, and for the first time, there was something in her eyes that did not match her words, something that flickered and disappeared too quickly for anyone else to notice. But not for him, never for him. If I am mistaken, he continued, his tone measured, careful, as if choosing each word mattered more than usual. Then help me understand why this feels familiar. Emily swallowed, the motion small but telling, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag as if grounding herself in the present was the only way to stay steady. People mistake faces all the time, she replied, and the sentence was simple, practiced even, but it lacked conviction, and somewhere deep down she knew it. He took another step forward, closing the distance just enough for the world around them to blur again, not physically, but emotionally, like everything else had dimmed in importance. Not like this, he said quietly, and something in the way he said it made her breath catch, because it was not arrogance, not assumption, it was certainty without proof, the kind that could not be argued with logic, only avoided, and she had become very good at avoiding. I really need to go, she said, and this time she did not wait for permission or response. She turned and walked out into the cold air, the doors closing behind her with a soft hiss that felt louder than it should have, and for a moment Alexander stood there, watching the space she had just occupied, the faint reflection of his own image staring back at him from the glass, unfamiliar in a way that had nothing to do with appearance. His assistant stepped closer, lowering her voice slightly. Do you want me to have security check her credentials? She asked, already prepared to act, but he shook his head slowly, his gaze still fixed on the doors. No, he said, quieter now, almost to himself. I want to know why I cannot remember something that feels like it changed everything. And outside, across the street, Emily stood on the curb for just a second longer than necessary. Her eyes closed briefly as the city noise rushed around her, and in that small, fragile pause, one truth pressed against the walls. She had built for years, not loud, not fully formed, but undeniable. They had met, and whatever happened that night had not just been forgotten, it had been buried, and she was the one who buried it. The wind cut sharper than Emily expected as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the kind of late afternoon chill that slipped through fabric and settled deep in her bones, but she barely noticed it, her mind racing faster than the traffic rushing past her. Every step she took away from the building feeling heavier instead of lighter, like distance was not solving anything, just stretching something invisible between them that refused to break. She tightened her grip on her bag and started walking toward the bus stop 2 blocks down, keeping her eyes forward, focusing on small things, the rhythm of her steps, the sound of a car horn in the distance, the flicker of a traffic light turning from yellow to red, anything to stay grounded in the present. Because the past was louder today than it had been in years, and she could not afford that, not now, not ever again. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out quickly. Almost grateful for the interruption, the screen lighting up with a message that softened her expression instantly. Mom, are you coming soon? Followed by a second message. I saved you the last cookie. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing just a fraction as she typed back. "I am on my way, sweetheart, 10 minutes. She slipped the phone back into her coat and crossed the street, her pace quickening now, pulled by something steady and certain, something that mattered more than anything behind her. But even as she moved forward, her thoughts slipped, uninvited, back to the way he had looked at her, not confused, not mistaken, but searching, like he had lost something important, and somehow believed she was the answer. She shook her head slightly as if the motion could erase the image, but it stayed, persistent, unsettling, because deep down she knew he was not wrong, not entirely. And that was the problem. Across town, 40 floors above the street, Alexander stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in his office, the city stretching endlessly beneath him. But he was not seeing any of it, his reflection faint against the glass, his mind replaying the same few seconds over and over, her voice, steady but distant, her eyes, calm but not empty. There had been something there, something familiar in a way that did not make sense. He turned slightly as his assistant entered, placing a tablet on his desk. "Your 5 o'clock meeting has been rescheduled to tomorrow morning," she said, watching him carefully. "And I pulled the visitor logs from the lobby. Like you asked?" Alexander nodded once, his attention shifting as he walked back to the desk, his movements controlled but purposeful, like he was following a thread he could not yet see clearly. He glanced down at the screen, scanning names, timestamps, entries that blurred together until one stood out, not because it was unusual, but because it was hers, Emily Carter. No appointment, no company listed, just a name, simple and unremarkable, except it was not to him. "Run a background check," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "Employment history, address, anything you can find." His assistant hesitated for half a second, not because the request was unusual, but because the reason behind it was unclear. "Of course," she replied, already turning to leave, but he stopped her with a slight lift of his hand. "And do not flag it as priority," he added, almost as an afterthought. "I do not want this to become a story." She nodded and exited without another word, leaving him alone with the quiet hum of the city and the faint echo of a memory that refused to fully surface. He leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for just a moment, and there it was again, not clear, not complete, but closer now, the sound of rain against glass, the sterile brightness of overhead lights, a voice near him, soft but urgent, saying something he could not quite catch, and a feeling, not fear, not pain, but something deeper, something that had mattered. He opened his eyes quickly, the image fading before he could hold onto it, and for the first time in years, Alexander Hayes felt something he did not have control over. Not his company, not his decisions, but a piece of his own past. And somewhere across the city, Emily stepped onto the bus, dropping a few dollars into the fare box, her reflection flickering briefly in the window as she moved to the back, taking a seat near the corner, her fingers brushing lightly against a thin chain hidden beneath her sweater, a small pendant resting just out of sight, something she had not taken off in years, something she never talked about. She closed her eyes for a second as the bus pulled away from the curb, the motion steady, predictable, nothing like the storm building quietly beneath the surface of a life she had carefully rebuilt, because some truths do not disappear, no matter how far you run, they wait, patient and silent, until the moment they are ready to be found. The bus rattled gently as it moved through the evening traffic, the rhythmic hum of the engine blending with the soft murmur of conversations and the occasional chime of stops being announced. But Emily barely heard any of it, her fingers still resting lightly against the pendant beneath her sweater as if it anchored her to something steady, something real. She kept her gaze fixed on the passing city lights outside the window. Storefronts glowing warm against the fading daylight, people walking with purpose, unaware of the quiet storm unfolding in someone else's life just a few feet away. She told herself she was fine, that nothing had changed, that it had just been a coincidence, a moment that would fade as quickly as it came. But the truth pressed harder with every passing block, because it had not felt like a coincidence, it had felt like recognition, and that was something she could not explain away, not anymore. The bus came to a slow stop near a small neighborhood lined with brick buildings and narrow sidewalks. Emily stood, adjusting her bag over her shoulder before stepping down onto the curb, The air here felt different, quieter, familiar in a way that calmed her just enough to breathe again. She walked the short distance to her apartment building, a modest 3-story structure with chipped paint near the entrance and a flickering light above the door. It was not much, but it was hers. A place she had built from nothing, step by step, decision by decision. Sacrifice by sacrifice. She reached into her pocket for her keys but paused when the door suddenly opened from the inside, a small figure rushing out with bright eyes and untied shoelaces. "Mom!" the little boy called out, his voice full of excitement as he ran straight into her arms. Emily dropped her bag just in time to catch him, kneeling slightly as she wrapped her arms around him, holding him a little tighter than usual. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, pressing a quick kiss to his hair, breathing in the familiar scent that grounded her instantly. "Did you wait long?" He shook his head quickly, looking up at her with a smile that made everything else fade. "Mrs. Thompson said I had to stay inside, but I was watching for you." He held up a slightly crumpled cookie in his small hand. "I saved this." Emily smiled, a real one this time, taking the cookie gently. "Thank you, that means everything," she said, her voice warmer now, steadier, and for a moment, just a moment, everything felt normal again. They walked inside together, climbing the narrow staircase to the second floor, the soft creak of each step echoing in the quiet hallway. Once inside the apartment, Emily set her bag down and watched as her son moved toward the small table, talking about his day, about a drawing he made, about a game he played, his words spilling out in a way that was simple and honest, untouched by the weight of things he did not need to know. She listened, nodding, smiling, responding when needed, but part of her mind drifted, not away from him, never away from him, but toward the question she had not been able to escape since she left the building. She glanced toward the small mirror hanging near the door, her reflection staring back at her, composed, controlled, but not untouched. She reached up slowly, pulling the pendant out from beneath her sweater, letting it rest in the light for just a second. It was simple, worn at the edges, nothing anyone else would notice, but to her, it carried everything. Her son's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom," he said, tilting his head slightly. "You look tired." Emily blinked, quickly tucking the pendant back into place, her hand lingering there for just a second longer before she smiled again, softer this time. "Just a long day," she replied, moving toward him, brushing his hair gently with her fingers, but as she did, something caught her attention, not his words, not his movement, but the way the light from the window hit his face, the shape of his eyes, the color, the quiet depth in them that she had always noticed but never allowed herself to fully question, until now. Her breath caught just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to shift something inside her, because for the first time, the memory she had buried did not stay hidden. It surfaced just enough to connect a line she had refused to draw, and across the city, in a high-rise office filled with glass and silence, Alexander Hayes stared at a file that had just appeared on his desk, one name at the top, Emily Carter, and beneath it, a detail that made his hand still for a moment longer than it should have, not confirmation, not proof, but something that felt like the beginning of an answer he was not prepared for, and somewhere between them. The past moved quietly, no longer waiting, no longer silent, but waking up. The apartment settled into a quiet rhythm as evening deepened, the soft hum of the refrigerator blending with the distant sound of traffic outside, and for most people it would have been an ordinary night, simple and uneventful. But for Emily, nothing felt ordinary anymore. She stood by the small kitchen counter, rinsing a cup that did not need to be rinsed, her movements slow and repetitive. As if the act itself could steady her thoughts, her son sat at the table nearby, coloring carefully. Within the lines of a page he had already erased twice, occasionally glancing up at her with the quiet awareness children sometimes carry without understanding why. "Mom," he said gently, breaking the silence. "Are you okay?" Emily turned toward him quickly, offering a small smile that came a second too late. "I am fine, sweetheart," she replied, drying her hands on a towel before walking over to him, brushing her fingers lightly across his hair. "Just thinking." He nodded as if that answer made sense, even if it did not fully, and went back to his drawing, content with her presence more than her words. Emily lingered there for a moment longer, watching him, memorizing the small details she had always taken comfort in, the way he tilted his head slightly when concentrating, the soft crease between his brows when something did not go as planned, the quiet determination that had always been there, and then, without meaning to, her eyes traced the familiar lines of his face again. The curve of his cheek, the shape of his eyes catching the warm light from the lamp above, and this time she did not look away quickly enough, this time the thought stayed, settled, refused to be dismissed. Because now it had something to attach to, a memory she had tried to keep fragmented, scattered into pieces that never fully connected, but tonight something had shifted, and those pieces were no longer staying apart. She turned away abruptly, moving back toward the sink, her breathing steady but controlled, as if she was holding something back that could not be allowed to surface. Across the city, Alexander sat at his desk. The file open in front of him, the name Emily Carter printed clearly. At the top, beneath it, details that should have been routine: age, employment gaps, current address, nothing unusual at first glance. But it was not the information itself that held his attention, it was the spaces between it, the missing years, the unexplained shifts, the quiet indications that something had happened that was not recorded in simple lines of text. He leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the edge of the desk, a habit he rarely noticed. "There is more here," he said quietly, not to anyone in particular, just acknowledging what his instincts had already decided. The door to his office opened softly as his assistant stepped inside. "I found something else," she said, placing another document in front of him. "It is not directly linked, but the timeline overlaps." Alexander glanced down, scanning quickly until one detail made his focus sharpen: a hospital name, a date, several years ago, late evening, admission records partially restricted. He did not know why that mattered yet, but something about it felt familiar in a way that was not logical. His mind reached for it, trying to connect it to the fragments he had been experiencing all day: the rain, the light, the voice, always just out of reach. "Get me access to the full record," he said, his tone calm but firm. His assistant nodded without hesitation, already moving to comply, leaving him alone again with the quiet tension that had begun to settle into something more defined, something closer to truth. Back in the apartment, Emily moved toward the small window, pulling the curtain slightly to look out at the darkened street below, her reflection faint against the glass, her hand once again finding the pendant beneath her sweater. This time she pulled it out slowly, holding it in her palm, her thumb tracing the worn edges as if it could tell her something she did not already know, something she had not already lived. Her son's voice drifted from the table again, softer now, almost casual. "Mom, do you think people can forget important things?" Emily froze for just a second, the question landing heavier than it should have. She turned back to him slowly, her expression gentle but thoughtful. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "but not because they want to." He nodded, accepting that answer with the simple trust only a child could give, and returned to his drawing. But Emily did not move, her gaze lingering on him, on the life she had built, on the choice she had made years ago without looking back, until now, because somewhere in the city, someone was starting to remember, and the truth she had hidden was no longer safe in silence. The night settled deeper around the small apartment, wrapping everything in a quiet stillness that usually brought comfort, but tonight it felt different, heavier, like the silence itself was waiting for something to surface. Emily stood by the sink a moment longer than necessary before finally turning off the light, leaving only the soft glow from the living room lamp illuminating the space. Her son had fallen asleep on the couch, his coloring book still open beside him, one crayon loosely held in his hand as if he had drifted off mid-thought. She moved toward him carefully, kneeling beside the couch and gently brushing the crayon from his fingers before pulling a thin blanket over him, her touch lingering for just a second longer than usual, as if grounding herself in something certain before everything else shifted again. She studied his face in the dim light, peaceful now, untouched by the questions that had begun to unravel her world, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe, slow and steady, until the quiet memory returned, not as a full image, not yet, but as a feeling, the same one that had followed her all day, something unfinished, something that had never truly been resolved. Across the city, the Lights in Alexander's office had dimmed as the building emptied floor by floor, but he remained, seated at his desk with the hospital record now fully open in front of him, the sterile digital document filled with lines of information that should have meant nothing more than data. But to him it felt like a key to something locked deep in his mind. He scanned the details again. The date aligning too precisely with the fragments he had been experiencing, the late hour, the emergency admission. The name redacted in parts, but not entirely. There were small gaps, small omissions that suggested something had been intentionally protected, or hidden. His fingers paused over the screen as his eyes fixed on a single note, brief and clinical. Patient accompanied by unidentified female. He leaned back slightly, the words echoing in his mind louder than they should have. Unidentified, yet present. Someone had been there. Someone who had not left a name behind. Someone who had mattered enough to be recorded but not enough to be remembered. And suddenly the question from earlier did not feel like speculation anymore. It felt like truth waiting to be uncovered. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the fragments rise again. The sound of rain striking glass in uneven rhythms, the sharp brightness of overhead lights, and then something new, a hand, not clearly seen, just felt, steady, grounding, a voice close to him. Soft but unwavering, saying something he still could not fully hear. But this time it stayed a second longer before fading, and when he opened his eyes, the certainty had grown stronger. He was not imagining this, he was remembering something real, something that had been taken from him, or perhaps something he had lost, and now it was beginning to return piece by piece. Back in the apartment, Emily stood by the window again, the curtain slightly parted as she looked out into the dark street below. Her reflection faint against the glass, her hand once again finding the pendant. This time she held it tighter, her thumb pressing into the worn surface as if it could hold back what was coming, because she felt it too, not in fragments like him, but in something deeper. Something she had carried every single day, the weight of a moment that had changed everything. Her eyes closed briefly as the memory pressed closer, the rain, the urgency, the feeling of standing at a crossroads with no time to think, only to act, and the choice she made without hesitation, a choice that had defined everything that came after. She opened her eyes again quickly, pulling herself back to the present. Because that was where she needed to stay, where she had built a life that did not depend on what had happened before. But across the city, the man who had been part of that moment was beginning to see through the silence she had created, and the distance between them, once safe and absolute, was no longer holding, because the past does not disappear when it is hidden, it waits until it is ready to return, and tonight, it was no longer waiting quietly. The morning arrived quietly, sunlight slipping through the thin curtains in soft, pale streaks that stretched across the small living room, catching dust in the air like something suspended between stillness and motion. Emily woke before the alarm, her eyes opening to a silence that felt unfamiliar, not because it was loud, but because her mind was already awake, already moving, already replaying everything she had tried to leave behind the day before. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of her son's breathing from the couch where he had fallen asleep, and for a brief second, she considered pretending none of it had happened, that it had just been a strange encounter, something that would fade like so many other things in life. But deep down she knew better, because this was not new, this was not random, this was something returning, something unfinished. She sat up slowly, running a hand through her hair before standing and moving quietly across the room, careful not to wake him. But as she reached the kitchen, she heard a small voice behind her. "Mom!" Soft, sleepy, but aware, she turned to see him sitting up slightly, rubbing his eyes, the blanket slipping from his shoulders. "Did you sleep here all night?" she asked gently, walking back toward him. He nodded, still half asleep. "I was waiting for you to come sit with me," he said simply, and something in those words settled into her chest with a quiet weight. She smiled, kneeling beside him and pulling the blanket back up around his shoulders. "I am here now," she said softly, brushing his hair back, and for a moment, just a moment, everything felt steady again, simple, real. But across the city, nothing felt simple anymore. Alexander stood in front of the same window as the night before. Except now the city was awake, alive, moving with purpose, but he remained still, his reflection faint against the glass, the hospital record now printed and resting on his desk behind him. He had not slept much, not because he could not, but because something inside him refused to settle. The fragments from the night before had not disappeared, they had sharpened, grown clearer in small, unsettling ways. He could almost hear the voice now, almost make out the tone, calm but urgent, steady in a way that suggested certainty, not fear, and that unsettled him more than anything else, because whoever she was, she had not been a stranger in that moment, she had been someone he trusted, even if he did not remember why. The door behind him opened softly, his assistant stepping in with a file in hand. "I was able to access more details from the hospital," she said, placing the folder carefully on his desk. "There are still restrictions, but one thing stood out." Alexander turned slowly, his attention shifting immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. "There was a child admitted the same night, a newborn." The word hung in the air longer than it should have, not loud, not dramatic, but significant in a way either of them fully understood yet. Alexander's expression did not change, but something behind it did, something subtle but undeniable. His mind moved quickly, not jumping to conclusions, not making assumptions, but recognizing a pattern beginning to form, pieces that had once felt disconnected now aligning in ways he could not ignore. "Do we have any link?" he asked, his tone steady. She shook her head slightly. "Not directly, but the timing is exact," she replied. "Same night, same facility, within hours." Alexander nodded once, his gaze drifting back to the window. But he was no longer seeing the city, he was seeing something else, something just beyond reach, a moment that was no longer completely hidden. Back in the apartment, Emily stood at the small stove, flipping a pancake carefully as the scent filled the room. Her son sitting at the table now, watching with quiet patience. The morning routine unfolding as it always did, simple, predictable, safe, but inside her, nothing felt predictable anymore, because for the first time in years, the life she had built felt like it was standing on something fragile, something that could shift at any moment. She placed the pancake on a plate and set it in front of him, smiling softly as he reached for the syrup, and as she watched him, really watched him, the thought she had been holding back finally settled into something real. Something undeniable, not spoken, not yet, but no longer avoidable, because somewhere across the city, a man was beginning to remember, and if he found the truth, everything she had protected would change, not suddenly, not loudly, but in ways that could not be undone. The morning light had shifted by the time Emily stepped out of the apartment, softer now, filtered through passing clouds that moved slowly across the sky as if even the day itself was hesitating. She held her son's hand as they walked down the narrow sidewalk, his small backpack bouncing lightly against his shoulders with each step, his voice filling the space between them with simple observations about the world, a dog across the street, a red car that looked faster than the others, a cloud shaped like a ship, and she listened, really listened, because it grounded her, because it reminded her of what mattered most. But even as she smiled and responded, something inside her remained unsettled, not loud, not overwhelming, but present, like a quiet awareness that things were beginning to shift beyond her control. They reached the corner where she usually stopped to wait with him until the school bus arrived, the same spot they stood every weekday morning, predictable and routine. But today it felt different, not because anything had changed around them, but because something had changed within her. She knelt slightly to adjust the strap of his backpack, her fingers lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "You have everything you need?" she asked gently. He nodded quickly. "Lunch, homework, and I remembered my book today," he said with a small smile, proud of the detail. Emily smiled back, brushing his hair lightly from his forehead, and then without thinking, her eyes met his again, really met them, and for a second, just a second, the connection was undeniable, not imagined, not uncertain, but real in a way that settled deep in her chest. She looked away quickly, standing as the sound of the approaching bus echoed down the street, the familiar hiss of brakes, the opening of doors, and the brief exchange of goodbyes that followed. "I will be here after school," she said softly. And he nodded, stepping onto the bus before turning back to wave. She waved back, holding the moment just a second longer before the doors closed and the bus pulled away, carrying him into the day ahead, leaving her standing alone on the sidewalk, the quiet settling around her again. But it did not feel the same anymore, because now the silence carried questions she could no longer ignore. Across the city, Alexander stood in a different kind of quiet, the kind that came from knowing something was about to change. He sat at the long conference table in a smaller private meeting room, the files spread out in front of him, several pages marked, notes written in precise, controlled handwriting. His assistant stood nearby, tablet in hand, waiting for direction. "There is one more detail," she said carefully, breaking the silence. "The child admitted that night did not have a listed father at the time." The words were simple, factual, but they carried weight. Alexander did not respond. Immediately, his gaze fixed on the document as if the answer might appear if he looked long enough. His mind moved through the pieces again, the unidentified female, the newborn, the fragments of memory that were no longer fading but sharpening with each passing hour. "And the mother?" he asked finally, his voice low, steady. She glanced down at the tablet briefly. "Records are partially sealed, but the name Emily Carter appears in the intake log." Alexander's hand stilled completely, not a dramatic reaction, not visible to anyone who did not know him well, but significant enough to mark a shift, because now it was no longer just a feeling, no longer just fragments, it was a connection, a line drawn between the past and the present that could not be erased. He leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly as the weight of that realization settled in, not as shock, but as clarity. And with that clarity came something else, a question that was no longer abstract, no longer distant, but immediate, personal, and impossible to ignore. Back on the sidewalk, Emily turned to walk away, her steps slower now, her hand unconsciously moving to the pendant again, her fingers curling around it as if holding onto it could keep everything else from slipping away. But deep down she knew that was no longer possible, because somewhere in the city, the truth she had protected was no longer hidden, it was being uncovered piece by piece, and the moment she had spent years trying to leave behind was no longer just a memory, it was becoming a reality she would have to face. Emily did not go straight home after the bus disappeared around the corner. She stood there a moment longer than usual, the empty street stretching quietly in front of her as if giving her space to think. But thinking was exactly what she had been trying to avoid. Her hand tightened slightly around the strap of her bag before she finally turned and began walking, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to keep moving. Because standing still felt dangerous now, like if she stopped, everything she had held together would begin to unravel. She passed familiar storefronts without really seeing them, the small bakery on the corner, the laundromat with its flickering sign, the coffee shop where she sometimes allowed herself a $5 indulgence when the week had been especially long. All of it felt distant today, like she was moving through a version of her life that no longer fit the same way. Across the city, Alexander remained seated at the table long after his assistant had stepped out, the room quiet except for the faint hum of the building's ventilation system, the file still open in front of him. But now it was no longer just information, it was a story, incomplete but undeniable, and he found himself not just reading it, but imagining the spaces between the lines, the moments that had not been documented, the decisions that had been made without witnesses. His fingers rested lightly against the edge of the paper as he replayed the words again. Emily Carter, newborn, same night, and something in his chest shifted in a way he could not ignore, not fear, not doubt, but something closer to responsibility. Even before he fully understood why, he stood slowly, pushing the chair back with a soft scrape against the floor before reaching for his jacket. His movements deliberate now, focused, as if a direction had finally formed where before there had only been fragments. He did not call for his driver right away. Instead he paused, looking once more at the name on the page, committing it to something deeper than memory, something that would not fade. Back on the street, Emily slowed as she reached her building, her steps faltering slightly as she noticed something out of place, a car parked across the street that did not belong to anyone she recognized. Sleek, dark, the kind of car that did not blend into this neighborhood. She told herself it meant nothing, that it could belong to anyone, but the thought did not settle as easily as it should have. She pushed the door open and stepped inside quickly, the familiar creak of the stairs grounding her as she made her way up to her apartment. But even there, even in the space she had built to feel safe, the unease lingered. She set her bag down and moved toward the window almost instinctively, pulling the curtain back just enough to glance. Outside, the car was still there, unchanged, unmoving, and something in her chest tightened just slightly, not panic, not yet, but awareness, because she knew what this meant, not in detail, not fully, but enough to understand that the distance she had relied on was beginning to close, and across the city, Alexander stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut with a quiet finality as he pressed the button for the ground floor, his reflection staring back at him in the mirrored surface, composed as always. But behind it something had shifted, something more personal, more urgent, because this was no longer about a missing memory. It was about a person, a life, and possibly something more than he had allowed himself to consider until now. The elevator descended smoothly, each passing floor bringing him closer to an answer he was no longer willing to ignore, and somewhere between the past he could not remember and the present he was beginning to understand, a single truth was forming, not spoken yet, not confirmed, but undeniable in the way it settled quietly into place. And when the doors opened, he stepped forward without hesitation, because for the first time since that moment years ago, he was no longer waiting for the truth to come to him, he was going to find it himself. The car remained parked across the street long after Emily stepped away from the window, its presence quiet but impossible to ignore, like a question that had already been asked and was now waiting patiently for an answer. She let the curtain fall back into place but did not move immediately, her reflection faint against the glass, her hand still resting near the pendant as if it had become the only constant she could rely on. She told herself she was overthinking, that the city was full of unfamiliar cars, unfamiliar people, and that not everything had meaning, but the thought did not settle, not anymore, because too many things were beginning to connect, too many moments that had once felt distant were now moving closer together, aligning in ways she could no longer dismiss. She stepped back slowly, exhaling as she turned toward the small table, trying to focus on something tangible, something real. But even the quiet of the apartment felt different now, like it was holding on to something unspoken. Across the street, inside the parked car, the driver adjusted his position slightly, glancing once at the building before returning his attention to the phone in his hand. A brief message already sent, a location confirmed, nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just information, because that was all that had been requested. And several blocks away, Alexander's car turned onto the street with steady precision, the city passing by in controlled motion outside the tinted windows, but inside, the silence felt more deliberate, more focused. He was not looking at his phone, not reviewing documents, not taking calls. He was simply watching, his gaze fixed ahead as if the destination itself carried more weight than anything else he had done that day, because it did, and he knew it, not in facts yet, not in certainty, but in something deeper, something that had guided every decision he had made since the moment he saw her. The car slowed as it approached the building, the driver glancing briefly in the rearview mirror. "We are here," he said quietly. Alexander nodded once, his hand resting briefly on the door handle before he paused, just for a second, not out of hesitation, but awareness, because stepping out of the car meant stepping into something he could not fully predict, something that would not be controlled by logic or preparation. And yet he did not pull back. He opened the door and stepped out, the cool air meeting him as the street settled into a quiet that felt almost deliberate. He glanced once at the building, taking in its details, the worn paint, the narrow entrance, the subtle signs of a life built without excess, and then he moved forward, each step measured but certain. Across the street, the other car remained still, unnoticed, unimportant to the moment unfolding. Inside the apartment, Emily felt it before she heard it, a shift in the air, a quiet sense that something had changed. Her head turned slightly toward the door, her body still, listening, and then it came, a soft knock. Not loud, not demanding, but clear enough to break the silence. Completely, her heart reacted before her thoughts could catch up, a steady rhythm that felt just slightly out of sync with her breathing. She stood there for a moment, unmoving, as if the space between the knock And her response mattered more than anything else, because once she moved, once she opened that door, there would be no more distance, no more pretending that the past was separate from the present. She took a slow breath, her hand instinctively brushing the pendant once more, grounding herself in the one thing she had never let go, and then she stepped forward, each movement deliberate, controlled. Her fingers reaching for the handle as the silence around her seemed to hold its breath, and on the other side of that door stood a man who was no longer searching for answers in fragments, but in truth, a truth that had already begun to find its way back to him, whether she was ready or not. The door opened slowly, not wide, not welcoming, just enough to reveal the space between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching into something heavier than silence, something filled with everything that had not been said yet. Emily stood there with her hand still on the handle, her posture steady but guarded, her eyes meeting his with a calm that did not fully reach beneath the surface. And Alexander remained where he was, just outside the threshold, not stepping forward, not crossing into her space without permission, but not turning away either, because this was no longer a question he could leave unanswered. "I did not come here to make assumptions," he said finally, his voice even, controlled, but carrying a weight that made the words land differently. Emily did not respond right away, her gaze holding his as if measuring something beyond the sentence itself, beyond the tone, beyond the reason he had come. "Then why are you here?" she asked quietly. And there was no edge in her voice, no accusation, just a question that demanded clarity. Alexander paused for a fraction of a second, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer mattered more than the words he chose. "Because something happened," he said, his eyes steady now. "And I was there, but I do not remember it the way I should." The honesty in the statement shifted something between them, subtle but real, because it was not a demand, not an accusation, it was a gap. One he was trying to understand rather than fill. Emily's fingers tightened slightly against the door, a small movement that might have gone unnoticed to anyone else, but not to him. "People forget things," she said, her tone measured, careful. "It does not always mean they need to be remembered." But even as she said it, something in her expression contradicted the simplicity of those words, something deeper, something that suggested the memory in question was not just a detail, but a turning point. Alexander took a slow breath, his gaze lowering for just a second before lifting again. "There was a hospital," he continued, not raising his voice, not pushing, just placing the truth between them piece by piece. "Late at night, the same night you were there." Emily's expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for someone unfamiliar to notice, but enough for him to see the shift, the way her composure tightened just slightly, the way her eyes flickered with something that was not surprise but recognition, and that was all he needed to know, that he was not wrong. "You should not have come here," she said softly, not as a warning, not as a rejection, but as a statement of something inevitable, something she had hoped to delay. "And you should not have been there," he replied just as quietly, not in contradiction, but in alignment, as if they were both acknowledging the same truth from different sides of it. The air between them felt different now, no longer uncertain, no longer distant, but charged with something that had been waiting for years to surface. Emily glanced past him for just a moment, her eyes briefly scanning the empty hallway, the quiet building that had always been her safe place, and then she looked back at him, her expression softer now, but heavier, as if the weight she had been carrying was no longer hers alone. "You remember parts of it," she said, more statement than question. Alexander nodded slightly. "Not enough," he admitted, "but enough to know it mattered." That word lingered, mattered, because it carried more than just significance, it carried consequence. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly as if something inside her had shifted, not breaking, not yet, but no longer holding as firmly as before. She stepped back from the door, not an invitation exactly, but not a barrier either, creating space where there had been distance. "You are not supposed to remember that night," she said quietly, her voice steady but no longer distant, and for the first time since he had arrived, there was something in her eyes that did not try to hide, something that acknowledged the truth instead of avoiding it. Alexander did not move immediately, his gaze fixed on her as the meaning of those words settled in. Not supposed to remember, not that he could not, but that he should not, and that changed everything, because it meant the silence between them had not been accidental, it had been chosen, and now, standing at the edge of that choice, neither of them could pretend it had not been made. Alexander stepped inside only after she moved further back, the door closing softly behind him as if sealing something that had been held open for too long. The apartment felt smaller than it looked from the outside, but not empty. Every corner carried signs of a life built carefully, deliberately, a small table with neatly stacked papers, a worn couch with a folded blanket, a child's drawing taped slightly crooked on the wall. Simple things, but they held weight, they told a story without words, and for a moment Alexander's attention lingered there, not out of curiosity, but recognition, because whatever had happened that night had not ended in that hospital, it had continued here. In ways he was only beginning to understand. Emily remained near the door for a second before moving toward the window again, creating space between them, not to distance him, but to steady herself. Her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table as she looked down, gathering something she had not intended to say out loud. "You were not supposed to remember," she repeated, her voice quieter now, less guarded, more real. "Because that night was not something you were meant to carry." Alexander watched her carefully, not interrupting, not pushing, because he could feel the shift, the moment where silence was no longer protecting anything. "Then why do I feel like I lost something?" he asked, and this time there was no distance in his voice, no control, just honesty, and it landed differently, because it was not about answers anymore, it was about understanding. Emily closed her eyes briefly, the question reaching deeper than she expected. Not because she did not know the answer, but because she had spent years making sure it did not need to be said. "Because you did," she said finally, turning to face him. Again, her eyes steady but no longer distant. "You lost a part of your life that would have changed everything." The words settled between them with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Alexander did not move, but something in him shifted. Something that had been held back by uncertainty now moving forward with clarity. "The hospital," he said, his voice slower now, more certain. "You were there when I was admitted." Emily nodded once, a small, controlled movement. "Yes," she said, and for a moment that was all, just a confirmation, just the truth placed gently into the space between them. But it was not enough anymore, not for him, not now. "And the child?" he continued. Not as a question, but as a connection, as something that had already begun to form in his mind before he spoke it. Emily's breath caught just slightly, the smallest pause, but enough to change everything, because silence in that moment was no longer protection, it was confirmation. She looked at him for a long second, the weight of years sitting in that space, the decisions, the distance, the life she had built to keep this exact moment from happening, and then slowly, she reached up and pulled the pendant from beneath her sweater, letting it fall into the light, her fingers trembling just slightly as she opened it, revealing the small, worn photograph inside. She stepped closer this time, not far. Just enough to close part of the distance, and held it out, not forcing him to take it, just offering the truth without words. Alexander looked down, his gaze focusing on the image, a younger version of Emily, tired but holding something close, and beside her, just visible in the edge of the frame, a man's hand, not clear enough to identify, but unmistakably present, and in that instant, something in his mind shifted from fragments to form. The rain, the hospital, the voice, the hand, not just felt, but seen, not just remembered, but understood. He did not speak right away, because the realization was not sudden, it was unfolding, piece by piece. Until it reached the one truth that could no longer be avoided. He lifted his gaze back to her, not with confusion now, not with uncertainty, but with something deeper, something that carried both clarity and consequence. And Emily did not look away this time, because there was no point anymore, no distance left to create, no silence left to hold, because the truth was no longer hidden, it was standing between them, fully seen, fully real, and impossible to ignore. Alexander did not take the pendant right away, his eyes fixed on the small photograph as if it held more than just an image, as if it carried the weight of everything he had been trying to understand since the moment he saw her. His hand lifted slowly, almost cautiously, before he finally held it, the metal cool against his fingers, the edges worn by time and touch, and for a moment the room seemed to quiet even further. As if the world itself was stepping back to let the truth settle, he studied the photograph again, not searching now, not questioning, but recognizing, because the fragments that had followed him all day were no longer fragments, they were aligning, forming something complete, something undeniable. The rain was no longer just a sound, it was a night. The hospital was no longer just a place, it was a moment, and the hand in that photograph was no longer distant, it was his, not in memory, not in clear detail, but in something deeper, something that did not require proof to be known. He exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, and when he looked up at Emily again, there was no uncertainty left in his gaze, only understanding, and something else, something quieter but stronger. "You stayed," he said, his voice low, not a question, not even a statement meant to be answered, just the truth spoken. Out loud for the first time, Emily nodded once, her expression steady but softer now. "There was no one else," she replied, and the simplicity of her words carried more weight than anything else she could have said, because it was not just about that night, it was about everything that followed, everything she had carried alone, everything she had chosen not to change. Alexander's grip on the pendant loosened slightly, his hand lowering as he absorbed the meaning behind what she had not said. The years, the distance, the life that had continued without him even knowing it existed. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked quietly, not accusing, not demanding, just needing to understand the choice that had shaped both of their lives. Emily looked at him for a long moment before answering, her eyes no longer guarded, no longer distant, but honest in a way that did not try to protect either of them. "Because you had everything," she said softly, "and I had something that needed me more." Her words settled into the space between them with a quiet certainty, not defensive, not regretful, just real, and for the first time, Alexander understood that the silence had not been about keeping him away, it had been about protecting something else entirely, something that had never been his to carry until now. He nodded slowly, not because he agreed, not because he accepted it completely, but because he saw it. He saw her, the choices she had made, the strength it had taken to make them, and the life that had grown from those choices. His gaze shifted briefly around the apartment again, the small details taking on new meaning, the drawings, the quiet order, the absence of anything unnecessary, all of it pointing to something he could no longer ignore. "He is mine," he said finally, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a calm certainty that did not need to be proven. Emily did not react immediately, she did not step back, did not deny it, she simply held his gaze, and after a moment, she nodded again, once, the smallest movement, but the one that changed everything. The room did not shift, the world outside did not stop, but something between them settled into place, not as a resolution, not as an ending, but as a beginning that neither of them had planned for, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to hide, nothing left to avoid, only a truth that had finally found its way back, and in that quiet, something else emerged, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, like the first step of something new, something that would not erase the past, but would no longer be controlled by it. And as Alexander placed the pendant gently back into Emily's hand, his fingers lingering for just a second before pulling away, he understood something he had not known before, that some moments are not meant to be remembered because they are meant to be lived forward. And as Emily closed her hand around the pendant, holding it not as a shield now, but as a bridge, the silence between them changed, no longer empty, but full of something neither of them could define yet, only feel. Something that had been there all along, waiting for the moment they were both ready to see it.